Were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon actually in Nineveh instead? Let's get into it. Hey friends, welcome back to Dig It with Raven. Today we're expanding on my last video about the hunt for one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. In the last video, we went into the ancient written accounts of the Hanging Gardens and explored if the archaeological record at Babylon could point to the remains of the gardens themselves. Alas, we weren't so lucky on our quest, as there doesn't seem to be any evidence for a garden in Babylon that would have qualified as a wonder of the ancient world. Depressing. And we aren't alone in being sad. Many people writing about them and trying to figure out if they even existed have come to the conclusion that there probably was never such a thing in Babylon. But have no fear, because Assyriologist Stephanie Dalley may have cracked the whole case wide open. She wrote this amazingly well-researched book called The Mystery of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that claims the gardens were never actually in Babylon and they weren't even built by Nebuchadnezzar. It's a great read, and I put a link to it in my description if you're interested. It's a little academic, but really, really well researched. Now you might ask, how can this be true? How can the gardens have never actually been in Babylon or built by Nebuchadnezzar when for hundreds of years we've just been assuming all of this? Well, it seems just like many things when it comes to studying the past, a lot of stuff can get lost in translation, literally. Only one of the 5 writers who described the Hanging Gardens attributed them to Nebuchadnezzar. Diodorus Siculus said that it was, quote, not built by Semiramis, but a later Syrian king, by which he means Assyrian. And Quintus Curtius Rufus wrote that tradition affirms that a king of Assyria reigning Babylon executed the work. Strabo said that the garden was in Babylon and on the Euphrates River, but didn't name a builder. The only ancient author to actually refer to Nebuchadnezzar by name was Josephus, who was quoting Berossus. Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over Babylon from 605 to 562 BCE, was quite a Bob the Builder. We have more than 200 of his official inscriptions, and many of them are complete, such as the East India House inscription that describes the building of his palace. We know exactly what he built during his reign. And the gardens are nowhere to be found in this list of achievements, which is especially strange because we have the accounts of the building of the palace, which is where the gardens are thought to have been, or at least close to it. Later writers who wrote about Babylon, like Herodotus and Pliny the Elder, make these very detailed descriptions of the city, but made no mention of the gardens either. On top of that, Nebuchadnezzar is a character in the Bible, and there's a part in it where he goes up to the roof of his royal palace to admire his city, and there's no mention of the garden. At this point, it's like the garden is fake news or something, especially because Nebuchadnezzar never mentions it himself, and if you're the guy who built a world wonder and loved to brag about all the things you built in your lifetime, I'd assume you'd make the garden spiel a top priority. You know what I mean? Since Josephus, care of Berossus, was the only one to mention Nebuchadnezzar, we probably have to take that with a grain of salt. Berossus himself may not have mentioned Nebuchadnezzar in connection with the Hanging Gardens, and his name was probably added to the original text by someone else who was quoting his work in the 2 centuries between his original writing and Josephus actually quoting him. And in Greek texts, there's no way of showing when a quotation begins and ends, so Josephus probably copied it from one of the other copyists, thinking that it was part of the original Berossus source text. It's like a really crazy game of ancient broken telephone. So we have one case of ancient confusion with the builder. If it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar who built these gardens, then who could these ancient writers have been talking about? For that, we have to look at the records we have for other Mesopotamian kings who built and wrote about their gardens to see who the real culprit could have been. We talked about how kings who came before Nebuchadnezzar built and were very proud of their gardens in the last video. So could it be that one of theirs was the actual legendary Hanging Gardens? In 1854, a sculpture panel was found in the North Palace of Ashurbanipal in the northern Mesopotamian city of Nineveh by Sir Henry Creswick Rawlinson. Ashurbanipal was the grandson of another Assyrian king, Sennacherib. I'll get to why I'm sharing the family tree in a minute. It's important, I promise. The sculpture was of a lush garden scene with rivers, a pavilion, and big trees. When Rawlinson found this piece, he said it had to be the Hanging Gardens of Babylon because it had a bunch of these things in common with those descriptions that we have from classical authors. In his mind, the garden in this picture couldn't possibly have existed in the city where it was found, which is a lot of conditional bias because of the fact that everyone talks about Babylon as the home of the coolest garden. It's easy to assume, especially when you're doing things with archaeology and relying off of historical texts, but that means you can miss a lot of things. It was originally thought that the prototypes for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were built in Assyrian cities like Khorsabad and Nineveh, which were located in northern Mesopotamia. Babylon is located in the south, and those areas are geographically different. Northern Mesopotamia is hillier with ridges, mountains, and valleys, while southern Mesopotamia is much flatter. Cities like Nineveh were located on the east bank of the Tigris, and there was an easy water supply from the mountains up there, whereas Babylon was located on the Euphrates River and had to depend a lot more on the streams and their irrigation technology to bring water into the city. Greek and Latin writers said the Hanging Gardens were built to imitate the natural landscape of a mountain, which is the terrain of northern Mesopotamia, is it not? Babylonian gardens were rectangular and flat and would have used the same irrigation ditch technology that they used for farming. There weren't any mountains nearby for an aqueduct to bring water into the city from an elevated level. And by the time Nebuchadnezzar built his palaces in Babylon, the citadel of the city was already 13 meters above the plane of the river. The city was so built up like this because of all the years of previous occupation getting put on top of the other. There's a lot of demolition, damage, and rebuilding, especially when you're building with mud brick and are located next to a river, because tides and stuff. So that means these hills form, and we call them tells from all of that extra building material getting built on top of. With the citadel already this high, it was already quite difficult to bring water up from the river. That means the geography around Babylon wouldn't have been the best for creating this type of mountain landscape garden that the classical writers were so amped about. Assyrian gardens in northern Mesopotamia, on the other hand, were built next to the king's palaces and were a lot more expressive in terms of trying to imitate natural landscapes like mountains and other spots of natural beauty. They would create these artificial hills and place mountain trees on the slopes. And because they were able to bring in water from aqueducts that use gravity to their advantage, they were also able to add running water to keep the plants green and to create streams that I would like to imagine as like little babbling brooks, essentially. I don't know what it is, but these mountain gardens just don't seem complete to me without a little babbling brook. This is the area where the royal palaces of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad were built near the Tigris River. They had a mountain range to the east, and they were able to bring this mountain water up to the high citadels that were also on these high tells through channels and aqueducts. That means the natural environment of the north made it a lot easier, possible even, to create a landscape garden within a citadel with slopes and streams and all the fun things that would go into creating a wonder of the world. Now, this is the type of garden that we think of when picturing the Hanging Gardens, and it's the one described by all of those ancient authors. That means the royal gardens we know of at Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad couldn't have been the prototype for a garden at Babylon because the conditions weren't right to create the same thing in two geographically different places. That means the Hanging Gardens had to be located in the north. So let's look at all of these supposed prototypes and give them the attention that they deserve. Assyria is home to a long-standing tradition of building extravagant palace gardens. Ashur-Nasir-Pal II created a garden in the 9th century BCE, diverting water from the Zab River. In his own writings, he talks about his sheer delight with the streams of water that travel through his fruit plants and nut trees. In the text, there's mention of canal waters gushing, tantalizing smells, and streams of water as numerous as the stars of heaven flow. We love a man who can just frolic in the glories of nature. It's beautiful. King Sargon II, who reigned from 722 to 705 BCE, built a garden at Khorsabad, and he described it as a high garden imitating the Amanus Mountains, in which are planted all the aromatic trees of northern Syria. All the mountain's fruits I created alongside Khorsabad. In his palace, a wall sculpture of a garden scene was found that shows a lake with a boat on it, a boathouse or pavilion of some sort, and an artificial-looking hill with an altar on top that's surrounded by trees. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BCE, also built a garden in Nineveh. And let me tell you, this one is a doozy. More garden-themed sculpture panels were found in his southwest palace. They don't survive today, but we do have drawings of them that were made at the time of discovery that are now housed in the British Museum. This drawing is aptly named Original Drawing 477. How original. Original Drawing 477, boy, I'm gonna get tired of saying that, shows 3 damaged panels that depict a sort of park that has a lake with what appear to be various military-style activities taking place. It seems to depict the garden at an early stage, as the plants seem recently planted and immature. On the left of the middle panel, you can see pairs of men rowing boats with horses on them, and a bunch of naked men are swimming with inflated animal skins. Another man looks like he's on a rope swing, just propelling himself into the water. I don't think that really counts as a military operation, but hey, whatever gets you the win, am I right? On the upper right of the panel, there's a hill with 2 streams that flow down into a larger horizontal one with at least 4 terraces below that stream. In the center, there's a group of 3 rows of 4 identical trees that could be saplings, and the lines beneath and beside them are probably irrigation channels. The foreground is cut off with a stream and men who appear to be marching along the citadel wall on the left-hand panel. The right-hand panel doesn't quite fit with the center one due to the loss of some of the material, but it shows 2 pillars and part of a third. Above these are 4 horizontal lines that show 4 layers of roofing with evergreen trees and small bushes or saplings planted on top. Freaking roof garden over here, hello! This whole trees on top of roofing matched the description of the hanging gardens by Philo, who said that the garden was supported by columns. Ooh. This whole notion of trees growing and thriving on top of the roof of a pillared walkway definitely fits the criteria for a technologically amazing wonder of the world. Finally, we have the earlier mentioned panel from Ashurbanipal's North Palace, which is believed to depict Sennacherib's original garden, but decades after it was planted, which shows just how well things were growing there. This panel shows an aqueduct bringing water to the garden and branching off into various streams that travel down a hill of trees. We can tell it's supposed to be a hill because of the slant of the trees on the surface, which is a great little artistic ancient art thing. If we assume this is the same garden, then the lake from the original drawing 477 has been cut off, and we're getting to see the other side that we couldn't see in the drawing. A complete picture, if you will. We also have a pavilion that's similar to Sennacherib's drawing, a little statue of the king, and then a pathway that goes down the hill that has a little structure that has been interpreted as either an outdoor altar or a stand for a lamp. If you look above the aqueduct, you'll see terraced rows of trees of at least 2 levels. In order to water these bad boys, water would have had to have been raised up by some sort of mechanism because their roots were planted on some sort of man-made vault. So how could this have been done? Could it be from those infamous screws and machines that Strabo and Philo were mentioning? Whoa. Maybe. These 2 scenes from Nineveh have so much in common from the classical descriptions of the hanging gardens resembling a mountain and having terraces that we just have to continue the investigation further to see if the water-bringing screws that were mentioned by Strabo were also a possibility. Today we call a screw that brings up water an Archimedes screw, and we generally attribute the invention to him. But Archimedes lived in the 3rd century BCE, which is hundreds of years after the gardens would have been constructed. Strabo doesn't mention Archimedes by name either, So could Sennacherib have invented it, or at least something like it, in the 6th century BCE? We have cuneiform texts that show how Mesopotamian kings were very interested in innovation, and it's possible that Archimedes saw this technology being used during his travels to Egypt, and then he wrote about it in his mathematical work called On Spirals. There was a tendency to attribute a lot of inventions to the ancient Greeks, and so this might have gotten lost in the shuffle because of his writings. And as luck would have it, we have proof. We've got an Assyrian text that talks about how Sennacherib invented a new method of casting bronze in order to cast water-raising bronze screws around 700 BCE so he could make a beautiful, jaw-dropping garden. The text was written on a clay prism that was first translated in the 1920s, back when the dictionaries for cuneiform weren't as robust and fleshed out as they are today. This led to a few mistranslations. The first translation was made in 1924, and it said that copper cables and pails were made, and great posts and crossbeams were set up over wells. Next, a translation was made in the 1950s that replaced pails with chains and crossbeams with date palms placed over wells. Date palms like the trees. Yes, I know it's strange. There was no explanation about the date palms, but the scholar Jürgen Lesu was also assuming a well for the technology used to water the gardens. Later, we discovered a word that was originally translated to mean they drank actually meant wax, and it was then realized that the word for well can also mean things like cistern, which makes a lot more sense in this context. So what we have here is Sennacherib possibly inventing some sort of lost wax bronze casting, which is really, really cool. The whole palm tree thing was still super confusing though, so then it was thought maybe Sennacherib is using this whole thing as a metaphor, like how we call a computer mouse a mouse, even though it isn't a mouse, but it kind of looks like one. The word for tall tree trunk in Assyrian literally means big log, and in the inscription there isn't any sort of grammatical identifier to indicate that they were talking about an actual tree. This word has also been found in another text referring to a math problem for calculating the capacity of a cylinder. So that means log can equal cylinder, which is one of the two things you need for a water-raising screw. This is where things really started to click for Stephanie Dalley. She investigated some trees and saw that the wild male date palm, which has been identified in some late Assyrian sculptures that show the landscape of southern Mesopotamia, have a spiral pattern. So if we take that into account, it's super plausible that Sennacherib did create a screw that lifted water, and he named it after what he thought it looked like in nature. Now, with all of this information we have available to us and the developments in the field, we're able to link the technical part of Sennacherib's texts with those descriptions given by Strabo and Philo. This is the new translation by Stephanie Dalley. I, Sennacherib, leader of all princes, knowledgeable in all kinds of work, took much advice and deep thought over doing that kind of work. I created clay molds as if by divine intelligence for cylinders, tall tree trunks, and screws, palm trees, trees of riches. In order to draw water up all day long, I had ropes, bronze wire, and bronze chains made. And instead of a shaduf, I set up the cylinders and screws of copper over cisterns. I made those pavilions look just right. I raised the height of the surroundings of the palace to be a wonder for all peoples. I gave it the name Incomparable Palace. A high garden imitating the Amanus Mountains I laid out next to it, with all kinds of aromatic plants, orchard fruit trees, trees that enrich not only mountain country, but also Chaldea, Babylonia, as well as trees that bear wool planted within it. Look at that! It sounds exactly like an Archimedes screw, and he calls his gardens a wonder for all peoples. There aren't any depictions of the screws in the original drawing 477, or the panel of Ashurbanipal, but given that they are technically supposed to be hidden anyways, this makes sense. Especially when Diodorus Siculus wrote, "There were machines raising water in great abundance, although no one outside could see it being done. And Strabo said that there were stairs rising up the slopes of the gardens as in a Greek theater, and alongside these stairs there were screws through which water was continually conducted up into the garden. And Philo wrote that the aqueducts allowed for water to be forced up by means of a screw. It's entirely possible because we have evidence of these large pieces cast of bronze from the Assyrians, and it looks like Sennacherib made improvements on the lost wax casting process by using clay molds. And he could therefore make a big bronze screw with a hollow center, so you could insert a pole, probably made out of wood or something, to rotate it and bring water up to his lush gardens. And this man was so excited about it that he wrote it down as a humble brag for all of us to marvel at thousands of years later. We love to see it, especially when it helps us solve the mystery of the Hanging Gardens. So, I don't know you guys, it's looking pretty convincing to me. But what's wild and confusing is that the Assyrian sculpture panels and the gardens themselves were created over 100 years before Nebuchadnezzar II even showed up to the party. So how on earth could the classical authors have confused Sennacherib and Nebuchadnezzar and Nineveh and Babylon? Turns out, pretty easily. Sennacherib was confused with Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Judith, which states, "It was the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar who reigned over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh." This book was already in circulation, and people were reading this fact at the same time that Josephus published his work and claimed that Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens, so that means both he and his readers would have been all mixed up over who was who and who was ruling over which place. This is why it's so important to check your facts, fam. One little mistake and bam, you just accidentally rewrote history and made an alternative timeline. More confusion comes from the fact that both Sennacherib and Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem, though Sennacherib only collected tribute and then went on to sack Babylon. Their attacks were about a century apart, so again, I guess it's a bit easy to mix them up. These two guys were also both known for their extensive buildings, so maybe they were just so alike that people found it really hard to differentiate between the two. The same sort of thing happened in confusing Nineveh for Babylon. Mesopotamia was far away for the Greek writers, so their geographical knowledge might not have been the best, and it seems like the names could have been easily mixed up. From Mesopotamian inscriptions, we know that the name Babylon means the gate of God. The city had lots of gates named after deities, like the famous Ishtar Gate, and Babylon had this name since at least the 12th century BCE. Sennacherib did something similar at Nineveh when he rebuilt the city walls and named its new gates after gods. This would have made it appropriate for Nineveh to also have been known as a Babylon, or rather, Gates of the Gods city. As for mixing up the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that one is a lot more understandable. Both of the rivers have a bunch of branches breaking off of them, and they were linked by an extensive network of canals. So once you confuse the cities, the rivers, of course, will follow. Now that we have all of this written and sculptural evidence, can we actually prove these gardens existed in the city of Nineveh by looking at the archaeological record? A large part of the palace has been excavated, and we have a lot of inscriptions about this palace building project, but unfortunately, no exact place that screams garden has been physically found. But another piece of evidence that points to the Hanging Gardens belonging to Sennacherib is that in one of his inscriptions, he states that a part of the palace was dedicated to his first wife, Tashmetu Sharat, which is very untraditional for kings at that time, as we don't even know the names of most queens. Nebuchadnezzar never makes any mention of his wife or wives, so this gives a strong connection with Diodorus's claim that the Hanging Gardens were built for a Syrian queen, and Josephus's account, who said it was built for a Median queen. Either way, we know Sennacherib loved his wife, and we're told the gardens were built for one. Coincidence? Maybe, but it makes a lot more sense than with Nebuchadnezzar. We also know that Sennacherib was quite the botanist and went out of his way to have exotic plants transferred to Nineveh. So it's just gotta be this one. Armed with this research, Terry Bell created a reconstruction of Sennacherib's garden at Nineveh by combining what we know from the classical text, the inscriptions from Sennacherib himself, and the sculpture drawings that had been found. He created the garden in the shape of a Greek theater, with it being steeped next to the southwest palace and on top of the main citadel. Archaeologically speaking, we have found some contours on the side of the mound that's next to the palace that indicate a theater-like depression that is the right size for the garden. It's steep, and it's overlooking the Coast River. The evidence just keeps piling up, friends. Could we have been so wrong for so long? It's happened before, so it definitely could happen again. It's been sort of an accepted truth until recently that the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE left the whole city completely abandoned forever. This means that ancient authors would have had no chance to see the gardens or write about them. And because of this bias that we have when excavating the city, a lot of archaeological layers that showed habitation in later centuries were ignored. Archaeology was still quite new back then, and it wasn't as much of a controlled science as it is today, so it's kind of understandable as to why it was all missed back then. It's really doubtful that an entire city would have been razed to the ground, and it's known that nowhere stays abandoned for long, especially if it's a city that's been inhabited for centuries. Archaeologists have found Hellenistic levels at Nineveh and renovations that were carried out on the Temple of Nabu not too far from the palace, and these renovations took place soon after the supposed destruction of the city, which proves my point here. So let's say that even though the gardens may not have survived in their fullest capacity after 612, the palaces and all of those sculptured panels would have been visible to visitors. They probably could have seen some of the evidence that was left of the gardens as well. And if the garden did survive and was maintained throughout the next rulers, then visitors could have seen those impressive screws in action, and some of the accounts that we do have could have been real eyewitness accounts. Sennacherib's palace garden meets all the criteria for a wonder of the ancient world, and even he knew it himself. It's such a good match to all of the ancient writings that people just assumed it was a precursor to the big deal in Babylon. But maybe his was the big deal and we've just been ignoring his feats for all these years. Aw, poor guy. That means that thanks to a different perspective and the motivation to explore beyond the assumed location, Stephanie Dalley and other researchers were able to discover that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or Nineveh for that matter, wasn't a myth after all. It was just as real as the other 6 ancient wonders. Sennacherib deserves credit where credit is due. The Hanging Gardens were never at Babylon, and history gets to be rewritten all thanks to a curious mind and the willingness to go against the grain. So what do you guys think? Is it a Nineveh? Let me know in the comments. If you liked that video, you know what to do. Smash the like, smash the subscribe so you don't miss the other wonders of the ancient world. Big thanks to all my patrons over on Patreon. If you like the channel, you get a lot of value out of the videos I make, and you want to help support it, head on over to Patreon and become a patron. You get early access to all the videos, you get to help me choose what videos are coming up next, and you get some other really cool stuff too. Stay curious about all these assumptions in history, you guys. And as always, stay dirty, my friends.